It begins with a tune so familiar that most of us can hum it without thinking. All around the mulberry bush, the monkey chased the weasel, a cheerful little rhyme passed down through generations, sung by children at play. But behind its playful rhythm lies a history few have ever questioned. Pop Goes the Weasel is not merely a nursery song. It was once a coded reflection of a harsher world, a world of poverty, pawnbrokers, and the struggles of 19th-century London's working class. What began as a lively dance tune in dimly lit taverns evolved into a children's rhyme stripped of its meaning. Yet every verse, every strange phrase, carries the residue of real lives lived on the edge of survival. This is the story of how a simple melody became a window into a forgotten past, and how beneath its innocent rhythm lies a haunting social truth waiting to be uncovered. The story of Pop Goes the Weasel begins in the bustling streets of 19th-century London. The city was changing rapidly. Factories were rising, railways were spreading, and thousands of families were moving in from the countryside looking for work. It was the heart of the Industrial Revolution, a time of invention and opportunity, but also of deep poverty and social inequality. In the crowded neighborhoods of East London, the sounds of street vendors, organ grinders, and traveling musicians filled the air. Music was everywhere, in pubs, in theaters, and on the cobblestones where ordinary people gathered to escape the hardship of their daily lives. It was in this noisy, restless world that Pop Goes the Weasel first appeared. The earliest known version dates back to the early 1800s, though the exact author remains a mystery. Some historians believe it began as a dance tune before it ever had lyrics. Its melody was catchy, simple, and easy to play on instruments like the fiddle or the barrel organ. This made it perfect for the working-class entertainment scene of Victorian London, where songs and dances spread quickly from one neighborhood to another. By the 1850s, Pop Goes the Weasel was already a hit in the city's music halls, the lively venues where people came to drink, laugh, and listen to comic songs. Newspaper reports from that period mention the tune being performed for audiences who clapped, stamped, and sang along. The title itself appeared on sheet music sold to the public, often without any credit to a specific composer. That's a clue to how widespread it had become. Pop Goes the Weasel wasn't the work of a single songwriter, but rather a piece of folk culture, something created collectively, shaped by the people who sang it, and altered as it spread. The phrase itself, though, puzzled people even back then. What exactly did it mean for the weasel to pop? To modern ears, it sounds like nonsense, just another bit of children's wordplay. But to a Londoner of the time, it made perfect sense. In Cockney slang, pop meant to pawn something, to take a personal item to a pawnbroker for quick cash, and a weasel, according to some interpretations, referred to a coat or a tool of trade, like a tailor's weasel used to measure cloth. When money ran short, people would pop the weasel, pawning their possessions to afford food or drink until payday. This insight gives us our first glimpse into the real world behind the rhyme. What sounds like a cheerful nonsense phrase was actually a reflection of economic struggle. Life in working-class London was precarious. Jobs were unstable, wages were low, and credit was hard to come by. For many, pawning goods was a way to survive from week to week. It wasn't unusual for a family to pawn their Sunday clothes on Monday and buy them back just before church the following weekend. The rhythm of Pop Goes the Weasel, upbeat and repetitive, may have captured the cycle of earning, spending, and pawning that defined daily life. As the song spread beyond the pubs and taverns, different versions began to appear. One of the earliest printed lyrics goes, "Up and down the city road, in and out the Eagle, that's the way the money goes. Pop goes the weasel." The Eagle, mentioned here, was a real place, the Eagle Tavern, a popular pub and music hall located on City Road in London. It was a famous gathering spot for workers, especially on weekends. By including the name of the tavern, the lyric paints a vivid picture. A man walking up and down the street, spending what little money he has, and then popping his belongings to keep going. It's a small window into everyday Victorian life, one that combines humor, resignation, and survival all in a few simple lines. But how did a song about working-class hardship become so popular? The answer lies in the social atmosphere of the time. Music halls were more than just entertainment venues. They were places where people could laugh at their troubles and share stories that reflected their own experiences. The humor in Pop Goes the Weasel was bittersweet. It acknowledged poverty while making it something people could sing and dance about. In an age when the poor were often ignored or judged harshly by the upper classes, these songs offered a sense of identity and solidarity. There's also another layer to consider. The mid-19th century was a period when traditional folk music and commercial entertainment began to merge. Songs that originated in working-class communities were often picked up by publishers and turned into sheet music for middle-class homes. The melody of Pop Goes the Weasel was catchy enough to make that jump. By the 1850s, it was being played in parlors as well as pubs. The same tune that once echoed through the alleys of London now filled drawing rooms across England. From there, it didn't take long for the song to cross the Atlantic. Immigrants carried it to the United States, where it quickly found new life in minstrel shows and parlor performances. American publishers printed their own versions, sometimes changing the lyrics to suit local audiences. The melody even became part of early children's games and dances. Within just a few decades, Pop Goes the Weasel had transformed from a coded expression of urban poverty into a piece of global popular culture. Still, its original meaning lingered in the background. Some Londoners continued to use the phrase "Pop Goes the Weasel" in conversation to describe pawning something. And in certain versions of the song, extra verses were added that made the social context even clearer. One verse, for example, mentions "a penny for a spool of thread, a penny for a needle," hinting at the lives of tailors or seamstresses barely scraping by. Another line, "That's the way the money goes," sums up the endless cycle of earning and losing, buying and selling, living and surviving. What's striking about all this is how a single song managed to capture both the humor and the hardship of its time. For the people who first sang Pop Goes the Weasel, it wasn't a children's rhyme. It was social commentary disguised as entertainment, a way to laugh at misfortune while acknowledging it. And because it was easy to sing and easy to remember, it became a kind of folk record of working-class life in the industrial age. Over time, as the song traveled and evolved, its rougher edges were smoothed away. In Victorian England, middle-class families often adopted folk songs but removed their darker or more controversial elements. This was part of a larger cultural trend, the sanitizing of popular music for respectability. When Pop Goes the Weasel entered the nursery, it lost its original verses about pubs and pawnbrokers. The lines that survived were those that sounded cheerful, innocent, and suitable for children. By the late 19th century, Pop Goes the Weasel had completed its transformation. What began as a social satire sung by adults in taverns had become a staple of childhood entertainment. It appeared in early music boxes, on phonograph records, and later in playground songs around the world. Its origins in poverty were largely forgotten, replaced by the image of a playful monkey chasing a weasel around a mulberry bush. Yet history leaves traces, and those traces are still there if you look closely. The rhythm of the song, the odd choice of words, the peculiar phrase that gives it its name, all hint at a past that refuses to disappear completely. When we hum the tune today, we are unknowingly echoing the voices of people who lived through the hardships of industrial London. We're repeating the rhythms of their labor, their humor, and their survival. As the 19th century drew to a close, Pop Goes the Weasel had already made its way from the smoky pubs of London to drawing rooms and schoolyards around the world. But even as the song became more respectable, something curious began to happen. People started to wonder what it really meant. The simple words were easy to remember but strangely difficult to explain. There was a feeling that behind the nonsense lyrics, there had to be something deeper, perhaps a story, a warning, or a secret message lost in translation. That curiosity sparked one of the longest and most peculiar debates in the history of English folk music. Scholars, folklorists, and even newspaper columnists began to dig into the origins of the rhyme, trying to decode what it was actually saying. Each came up with their own interpretation, and over time, Pop Goes the Weasel became more than just a song. It became a mystery, one that exposed the social anxieties, moral struggles, and class divisions of the era that produced it. One of the earliest serious discussions about the rhyme's meaning appeared in the mid-1850s, shortly after the song became popular. People noticed that the phrase, "Pop Goes the Weasel," had entered everyday speech as a kind of proverb. To pop something meant to pawn it, as the working classes often did to survive, but not everyone wanted to admit that. Pawning was associated with poverty, and poverty was seen as shameful. The song, then, might have been a way to joke about it indirectly, a kind of coded humor that let people acknowledge hardship without saying it outright. At the same time, others began to suggest darker interpretations. Some believed the rhyme was about alcoholism. The line, "That's the way the money goes," seemed to describe a cycle of spending and regret, while the reference to the Eagle, the famous London pub, hinted at a drinking culture that ruined many lives. In this view, the weasel wasn't a coat or a tool, it was a person, perhaps even a symbol of the man himself, destroyed by drink. When he popped, it meant his downfall. This moral reading fit neatly with the growing concern about alcohol in Victorian society. The temperance movement, a campaign promoting abstinence from alcohol, was gaining strength throughout Britain. Its supporters often looked for ways to warn people about the dangers of drink, and popular songs became a convenient tool for spreading that message. Whether Pop Goes the Weasel was originally written as moral commentary or not, the public was ready to interpret it that way. In pamphlets and sermons, reformers pointed to the rhyme as an example of how addiction could consume one's livelihood and dignity. By the late 19th century, the song had become part of a much larger conversation about morality, poverty, and social reform. The Industrial Revolution had created immense wealth for some and misery for others. The gap between the classes was visible everywhere, in the neighborhoods, the clothing, even in the way people spoke. Folk songs like Pop Goes the Weasel acted as mirrors to that inequality, whether people realized it or not. They told the stories that official histories ignored, the struggles of tailors, laborers, and domestic workers who lived one paycheck away from ruin. Folklorists who studied the song in the early 20th century began to notice how it changed over time. Every version carried the same catchy refrain, but the verses shifted depending on who was singing it. In one version, the singer pawns his coat to buy food. In another, he spends his last penny on drink. In yet another, he's mocked for his bad luck. The tune stayed constant, but the meaning adapted to fit different social settings. That flexibility may be why the song survived when so many others faded away. It could speak to almost anyone, whether they saw it as comedy, tragedy, or simple nonsense. One of the most fascinating developments came when the song crossed into the United States. By the time it reached American audiences in the mid-1900s, it had already lost most of its original references. The London taverns and Cockney slang didn't make sense to Americans, so new verses were written. In children's books and school collections, the song was paired with lines about monkeys, mulberry bushes, and playful chases. It was cheerful, rhythmic, and harmless, the perfect material for a nursery rhyme. But even in this sanitized form, there was something haunting about how the song refused to disappear. It kept resurfacing in new contexts, from playgrounds to television shows. In each generation, people rediscovered it without realizing they were repeating a piece of 19th-century street culture. That endurance led some historians to suggest that the song's deeper meaning had survived in subconscious form, that its rhythm and repetition carried emotional weight even after the words lost their connection to reality. During the early decades of the 20th century, Pop Goes the Weasel appeared in countless forms, as a marching tune, a dance melody, and even as a children's game. Yet a few writers continued to investigate its origins. In the 1930s, an English folklorist named James Reeves suggested that many old nursery rhymes were actually fragments of lost ballads, songs that once described real events but were later reduced to nonsense by time and censorship. According to this idea, Pop Goes the Weasel might have once told a specific story that was gradually erased as it passed from adults to children. Reeves and others pointed out that Victorian society often cleaned up or disguised songs that seemed too vulgar or political for polite audiences. Other researchers went in a different direction. They argued that the rhyme's structure, short, rhythmic, and full of sound effects, showed how language can preserve culture even when the literal meaning fades. In this view, Pop Goes the Weasel became a kind of musical fossil holding traces of the world it came from. The pop itself, a sharp and satisfying sound, symbolized the abruptness of loss, the moment something valuable disappears. It was both funny and tragic, just like the life of the people who sang it. As the 20th century moved forward, the song found new life in popular media. In the 1930s and 40s, it appeared in cartoons, radio shows, and early television programs. Children sang it while skipping rope. Orchestras played it as light entertainment. Its melody even appeared in early mechanical toys and music boxes. The irony, of course, is that by then, almost no one knew that the song had once been about pawning clothes and scraping by in industrial London. The cheerful tune that echoed through nurseries and cartoons was born out of hardship, yet it now symbolized innocence and fun. That contrast fascinated cultural historians in the post-war years. How could something with such grim origins become a universal symbol of childhood? Some suggested it was an example of how societies erase uncomfortable truths. When a culture wants to forget its painful past, it often turns those memories into entertainment. The working-class song that once criticized social inequality became, over time, a harmless jingle. In a way, it reflected how history itself gets rewritten, not through lies, but through gradual forgetting. Even so, a few traces of its original meaning never completely vanished. In certain London neighborhoods, older generations still used the phrase, "Pop Goes the Weasel," well into the mid-20th century to describe pawning an item. And in folk collections, the original lyrics survived in dusty archives and forgotten notebooks. When researchers rediscovered them, they were struck by how direct and human they were. They weren't written as poetry or moral lesson. They were the voice of everyday people making sense of their difficult lives through humor and rhythm. In the last few decades, as historians have taken renewed interest in everyday culture, the song has regained its historical importance. It's now seen as a rare example of how working-class creativity shaped British identity. Rather than being a meaningless nursery rhyme, Pop Goes the Weasel is evidence of how ordinary people used art to express their experience, to laugh at hardship, to share stories, and to find joy in survival. The story of the song's evolution is also a story about how meaning changes when it moves from one group to another. For the poor laborers of 19th-century London, it was social satire. For the middle-class Victorians, it became a fashionable dance tune. For Americans, and later generations of children, it turned into a cheerful rhyme. Each version reveals something about the people who sang it, their humor, their fears, and their desire to make sense of the world. By tracing this transformation, we begin to see how a simple song can contain an entire social history. It reminds us that culture isn't made only by kings, inventors, or artists. It's also shaped by the anonymous voices of the street, the factory, and the pub. Pop Goes the Weasel survived because it belonged to everyone. Each singer added a little piece of their own story until the song became a shared memory, one that crossed oceans and generations. When we listen to Pop Goes the Weasel today, it feels simple, almost meaningless. But the simplicity is deceptive. Behind the short, rhythmic lines is a reflection of human struggle, humor, and survival. The song is a perfect example of how culture transforms over time. how something born out of poverty and hardship can turn into a global symbol of childhood innocence. Its endurance across centuries reveals how powerfully music can adapt to changing societies, carrying with it traces of forgotten truths. The deeper meaning of Pop Goes the Weasel lies in its ability to capture the everyday life of working people without preaching or complaining. It tells a story that was never written down, only sung. The phrase, "pop," speaks of loss, the quick, sudden act of giving up something valuable. The weasel represents what little one owns, a coat or a tool of trade. Together, they describe the fragile balance between work, survival, and dignity. That balance has defined the lives of ordinary people in every era, not just Victorian London. In a way, the song is not just about pawning a coat. It's about the constant trade between what we have and what we must give up to keep living. Over time, this small piece of music took on layers of meaning. To sociologists, it became an example of how folk songs preserve class consciousness. To linguists, it demonstrated how slang and idioms reveal the economic realities of a society. To cultural historians, it showed how popular entertainment reflects hidden anxieties. The song may seem trivial, but its survival proves it spoke to something real, something universal. The irony of Pop Goes the Weasel is that it was never meant to last this long. Most folk songs from that period disappeared as new technologies and tastes emerged. But Pop Goes the Weasel was different because it adapted. Each time it entered a new culture, it took on a new identity. In the United States, it lost its connection to pawning and poverty, but it gained new symbolic power as a children's rhyme. Its lively rhythm matched the growing American fascination with play, leisure, and early education. The song was even used in early phonograph recordings, which helped preserve it long after other folk songs vanished. By the mid-20th century, the melody was so well known that it appeared in films, cartoons, and television programs. Composers used it for comic effect, relying on its familiarity to make audiences smile. One famous example is its use in the cartoon The Three Stooges, where the tune plays during scenes of slapstick humor. The contrast between its dark historical meaning and its cheerful modern use became almost poetic. What was once a symbol of hardship had turned into a symbol of laughter. This transformation says a great deal about cultural memory. When people no longer recognize the context of a song, they fill it with new meaning. Pop Goes the Weasel became whatever people needed it to be: a lullaby, a dance, a joke, or a nostalgic tune. Yet underneath it all, the rhythm and the phrase remained unchanged, quietly carrying echoes of the past. This is what makes folk traditions so powerful. They can hide entire histories inside something that seems harmless. In a broader sense, Pop Goes the Weasel represents the way societies rewrite their own histories. Every culture has examples of songs, stories, or rituals that began as something serious and ended as entertainment. In Japan, for instance, some nursery songs originated from work chants sung by laborers. In parts of Africa, rhythmic children's games trace their origins to songs used by farmers or fishermen. And in the American South, many spirituals and blues songs started as expressions of suffering under slavery, but later became celebrated pieces of national heritage. These transformations are not accidents. They happen because societies often find it easier to remember joy than pain. When a song like Pop Goes the Weasel survives, it carries a hidden message: that art has a way of softening history without erasing it completely. Beneath the cheerful melody is a silent acknowledgement of struggle. When children sing it today, they may not know its origins, but they still participate in a chain of memory that stretches back more than a century and a half. There is also a symbolic element in how the song mirrors the rhythm of life itself. Each verse builds up to the same sudden moment. Pop goes the weasel. That pop is abrupt, final, and unavoidable, like a small explosion that resets everything. In the context of working-class life, it represented the sudden loss of something essential. But on a broader level, it can be seen as a symbol of how life moves in cycles, gain and loss, effort and exhaustion, hope and disappointment. The sound of the word pop captures that perfectly. It is sharp but almost playful, a way of laughing at something painful. The universality of this rhythm might explain why the song has lasted so long. Even without understanding the words, people recognize the feeling it conveys. There is something both comic and tragic about it, a brief moment of energy followed by silence. This combination of lightness and depth is what gives the rhyme its emotional power. In modern psychology, some researchers have noted that repetitive, rhythmic songs can serve as coping mechanisms. They help people process stress and uncertainty by turning emotion into structure. When viewed through that lens, Pop Goes the Weasel becomes more than a historical artifact. It becomes a human response to instability, a way to make chaos predictable through repetition and rhyme. The song may have been born out of poverty, but it offered a rhythm that made hardship bearable. As the world entered the digital age, Pop Goes the Weasel continued to evolve. It found new life in electronic toys, video games, and children's programming. Even when sampled or remixed, it retained the same playful identity. Yet, every time it reappeared, it reminded historians of its strange journey, from a coded street song about survival to a global cultural reference. It proved that the boundary between adult culture and children's culture is thinner than we think. Many of the songs we associate with innocence were originally meant for grown-ups, shaped by adult experiences of loss, work, and resilience. Its endurance also highlights how language can preserve fragments of the past long after their meanings have faded. The phrase, "Pop Goes the Weasel," may sound meaningless now, but the word pop still carries echoes of its 19th-century use in British slang. In that sense, the song acts as a time capsule, preserving the sound and rhythm of Victorian English speech. Linguists often point out that nursery rhymes are valuable because they freeze old forms of language that might otherwise disappear. So, even in its playful form, Pop Goes the Weasel continues to teach us about where we come from. In Britain, the song has even reappeared in moments of social reflection. Artists and musicians have occasionally used it to comment on class, consumerism, or nostalgia. Its tune has been quoted in television shows, political satire, and even protest art. In each case, the use of the song adds irony, a reminder that behind every cheerful melody there might be a story of struggle. The contrast between its sound and its meaning creates a subtle but powerful form of social commentary. Cross-culturally, the song's journey is part of a much larger pattern. In many parts of the world, children's songs that seem innocent often come from adult realities. In France, Alouette began as a work song about plucking a bird for food. In Germany, Ring-a-Ring-a-Roses is linked to the memory of the plague. In the Caribbean, Brown Girl in the Ring carries echoes of colonial history. These examples show that what we call nursery rhymes are rarely just for children. They are survival stories turned into rhythm, ways for communities to hold on to memory without dwelling in pain. When seen from that perspective, Pop Goes the Weasel becomes part of a global human tradition. Every culture transforms its fears and hardships into songs that can be shared. What begins as a story of struggle becomes a tool for joy, teaching, and connection. It's a reminder that music's true purpose isn't just entertainment, it's memory. It helps people remember who they are, even when they don't realize they're remembering. The song's cultural impact goes beyond music. Its structure, the quick build-up and sudden release, can even be found in modern storytelling and humor. The idea of tension followed by a pop has become a basic pattern in comedy and narrative rhythm. The very phrase, "Pop Goes the Weasel," has entered the English language as a metaphor for sudden change or collapse. It appears in literature, journalism, and casual conversation. Without realizing it, we still use the rhythm of that old tune to describe life's surprises. In the end, Pop Goes the Weasel is not just a nursery rhyme or a relic of Victorian street culture. It is a living document of human resilience. It shows how people turn struggle into art, loss into laughter, and survival into memory. That is why it has endured when countless other songs have not. It tells us something essential about ourselves, that even in hardship, people find ways to sing. Pop Goes the Weasel began as a tune of survival, born in the crowded streets of 19th-century London, and evolved into a symbol of universal childhood. Along the way, it carried hidden meanings about poverty, resilience, and the cycles of life. Its transformation from a coded song of hardship to a cheerful rhyme shows how culture reshapes memory, often turning pain into play. Behind its catchy melody lies the history of ordinary people who found ways to turn struggle into song. And every time the melody plays, that forgotten history quietly sings again.